Hello everybody. Having had to think very hard about which photographs I would use to illustrate my talk about urban segregation, I decided architects would be overwhelming on that front, and so I'd have no photographs and I'd just talk about urban segregation, how it happens, what its dangers and risks are, whether we can overcome it. So I just wanted to start with where our history brought us from and what it led us to. And if we just imagined that traditional urban density meant that proximity and sharing and interdependence were absolutely key in societies right up to, well, actually, de facto right up to today, but more visibly and more directly in cities up till the Industrial Revolution. And when once that happened, and this country had the longest, harshest Industrial Revolution in the world, anybody who had a planning idea or an architectural or a design idea or a social reforming idea wanted to redesign in order to sanitize and clean up the Industrial Revolution, and that involved remaking cities. So all of our modern roots in the kind of thing that Anna Minton was talking about, for example, do lie in very utopian, sometimes government-led, sometimes private-led plans to make places better. And the three sort of most obvious models are the Garden City model, which was a very collective but private model where developers would collectively invest and share the profits back into the communities that they were creating. We only managed to build two because it was very difficult, particularly to persuade private people to invest lots of money and then not get the profit. We had lots of employer villages, which still stand as models, the Bournevilles, the Rowntrees, the Port Sunlights and so on. And then the government took on new towns. And all of those models had equality and sharing and cross-class and cross-income kind of ideas and social betterment in order to rescue people from poverty. What we were forced to do in practice was something much more banal: clear slums and build council estates, and then have suburban escape for those that didn't want to or weren't part of those programs. So we did end up with very divided cities through public action, often derived from private models. And that's led us, with all the other drivers that are going on, to a highly urban society with highly unequal areas and unequal neighbours. And we've only got to look at the way our housing is owned and maintained, the way our street conditions are maintained. And I thought the public health talk was really very inspiring and incredibly horribly clear on what happens to open spaces and public amenities between poor and rich area, how our social conditions are shaped by a mixture of who lives where and what the place is like in the first place. So whether it's education, crime, social abuse, general street damage, access to all sorts of good things. And the counter to all of that, so that all sounds as though it's all going really badly wrong and all pulling apart. The counter to all of that is that there is a high value attached to anything that's shared space and that's communal facilities. And I've done lots and lots of work in very difficult council estates, and the very surprising thing you discover in the very worst and most difficult areas is that there are actually lots of shared and common facilities. They're often very poorly maintained and therefore they're poorly used, but there are lots of them. And we do have in this country one huge value that I've not heard talked about very much, which is a vast public infrastructure: parks, roads, railways, canals, libraries, and all these other things that I completely agree, schools, universities, hospitals, are under threat and under pressure. But if we think of the huge scale of that public infrastructure and the way that the public threat is actually now nibbling away at them, we have an awful lot to hold on to. And that's something I would really urge, maybe in the roundup session, people to think much more about. How do we actually hold on to what everybody, when they're asked, says they really value and care about, which is shared spaces. What happens in unequal areas is that, for example, children aren't allowed to use the shared spaces because parents are too scared of the conditions. So children from poor families in poor areas go out on the street a lot less, go to parks a lot less, use swimming pools a lot less, go to youth clubs a lot less, because parents are too scared. So, and our families study showed that very, very clearly. The drivers of this kind of split that's gone on, I think, are broadly twofold. This is a gross oversimplification, but income inequality is the biggest, and we did have huge income inequality all the way through the Industrial Revolution and basically right up to the Second World War, which then got driven down by Labour governments and by a consensus that that didn't work, and it's now being driven up again. We are nowhere near, actually, the income inequalities that we had in the 19th century. We're still very alarmingly moving in completely the wrong direction. And the other very alarming, and I don't think it should be underplayed, division is a racial division. We do not have ghettos on the whole. We do not have the kind of racial segregation and separation that exists, for example, in the United States or in lots of other countries. But there are alarming trends that I think we should be very, very aware of. I did lots of work in Bradford around exactly this issue. And one of the things that was happening in Bradford and is happening in London far faster than area segregation is school segregation. And I think that should be shouted about a lot, because there are whole areas of London where children grow up in segregated schools. Parents don't like it of any races, and teachers don't like it, but nobody dares to shout about it. The head of the City of London actually shouted about it, and I thought it was very brave of him. It didn't go very far. So what are the other factors that people have been referring to that are really, really current? For me, the most current and most alarming is we've always wanted to invest in property and houses, and you know, the Englishman's home is his castle. We've been driving and supporting publicly through government funds owner occupation since 1919, so it's a very, 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 very long history of subsidising owner occupation over renting of any kind, which is why we ended up in 1980 with 10% private renting, completely out of line with every other European country. But today, property has become the new gold. Since the banking crisis, everybody who's in a vulnerable country, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Russia, China, where are they looking to invest their property? In what's considered a safe banking country. So we, with all the catastrophes that we've had in our banking system, are considered a safe banking country because we protect property rights to such a degree. Because since 1919, we've had that philosophy. So I think the property is the new gold. It's both highly divisive, it's changing tenure mixes. So, for example, London's private renting is absolutely escalating. I personally don't think that's a problem. I think that's actually could be a positive thing. It's not positive if we have no regulation at all, if we have no standards at all, if we have no security at all. But those three things are fixable. And I do know unofficially that the government thinks they should be fixed as well. So that's just a little drop-in of mine. But one of the consequences is that under-occupation of property is absolutely going through the roof. So Richard Best has done lots of work on this. 4.3 million empty spaces in homes in this country, which can't be occupied by anybody because they're privately owned. And meanwhile, overcrowding rising in all the poorest communities and in the social housing tenures and in the private rented sector. So that inequality of space, and there are very big tax drivers to that that could be changed. And I have to say the most interesting little gem that I've got to throw into there is that Switzerland, the banking capital of the world, it happens to own the Alps, and so it controls speculation of property. So I'll just throw that in. I'm trying to get a Swiss bank to sponsor me to study their system so that we can import it here, which isn't what we normally want to do, but actually controlling property speculation has become, I think, a really burning hot potato. And we've done quite a lot of work. We're very popular at the moment in the kind of research we do because housing associations are extremely worried about the implications for this. I'm arguing with them. This could be the most positive time of all for you. You are the model landlords. You are decent, non-profit, long-term landlords who actually care about your tenants. All you're trying to do, housing associations, is become like developers. Everybody hates developers. Why don't you try and be better long-term, good landlords? And so quite a few of the recent reports we've got, like, for example, the Orbit report on which we call Bigger Than Business, trying to argue that Orbit should be much more concerned, which they agree with, so that's really good, with being good, non-profit, long-term, slow development landlords for low to modest income people, rather than trying to develop for profit, selling houses in Shanghai. The standard big housing association now goes to Shanghai to sell speculative property in order to generate enough income to build social housing. That has to be completely stupid. So that is a big factor in the new kind of urban pressures that we're experiencing. But there is a complete counter to this, which again we're not kind of giving enough attention to, which is that as population overall rises and as households fragment, so the demand for housing really goes through the roof. Population isn't going through the roof, it's right, as Danny would no doubt explain. It's rising, but rising somewhat slowly, but household formation is rising fast. And if we think that we can provide houses for every new household that forms, we are wrong. We can't do it. It's actually impossible, which means that we have to increase density and we have to push people together. We have no choice. Shared space has become an absolute must. And that means that we have to think about, for example, how we house single people, how we house young mobile couples, how we house late childbearers, how we house young quit the nest, empty nesters, and an ageing population. We've got all these household pressures on housing that we're not actually responding to sensibly. So in spite of all the building that's going on, in many cases, density is actually going down. And the most famous example of that is Kensington and Chelsea, which is the most in-demand borough that there is, and is the one London borough that actually lost population over the last census period, precisely because of the under-occupation, speculative buying, shrinking of household size, quitting of families because it's unaffordable, and all of that. So actually, revaluing density and urban mix seems to me to be really important, because the more dense you make places, the more populations actually do have to mix. And I think East London is a very, very interesting example of that. So there's one particular part of Tower Hamlets where the council housing, it's basically all council housing, ex-council housing, has been transferred to a small association, and where the links between blocks have been taken out. The tenants were very upset at first, but they eventually agreed that it would be a good idea, in order to use that gap between the buildings to make actually an extra row of flats that joined the buildings together with human dwelling spaces, instead of with bridges that were drafty and that were dirty and that were scary. And I saw it with my own eyes. I talked to the people who live there, and it's incredibly successful. And it's created what I'd call a low-level sort of gentrification. So the people in the blocks that were already there were typical, standard, long-term or short-term, low-income tenants, and the people who moved in were kind of modest people in reasonably paid jobs who could get into shared ownership on a 25% stake. So they weren't well-off people, but they were a little bit better off, and they actually positively were thrilled to get the chance of living in this very diverse place and have integrated, because they have absolutely no choice but to integrate. People are literally cheek by jowl. I think that's really very interesting. And so I think that kind of organic growth and organic increase in density through infill and through conversion and through remodelling is really interesting. We've just done a report not for Kensington and Chelsea, but for Octavia Housing on Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. What do you do about cheap housing owned by social landlords in very high-cost areas? You've got a terrace property with 3 social housing units in it. The property for sale on the market is worth £10 million. You could buy an awful lot of houses in Barking for that money. Do you get rid of the 3 tenants, sell the property to some foreign speculator, and be done with it, and move your 3 tenants, quite easy to do really, only 3 of them, and then get 20 houses in a cheap part of London? And, well, anyway, you can read the report. It's called Divided City, but it has really evoked a huge interest, because nobody, actually, interestingly, rich or poor, seems to want a divided city. So the rich people we spoke to in Kensington and Chelsea were just as indignant about that idea as the poor people. Obviously, the poor people felt much more threatened by it. That's the big difference. So then the question is, can we share? Gosh, it's really hot, or is it just me because I'm talking? God, it's boiling in here. Yeah, it'd be great, a little bit of air. So can we share? Because my argument is we have no choice but to share. We might not wish we had to share, but the fact is we have to. I think that the threats that Anna talked about this morning of the privatisation of public space are real. On the other hand, I think enclosure at some level is very important in a dense city. So we go to every European city, including our beloved Copenhagen, and we go to the, renovated areas like Vesterbro in Copenhagen and Nordebro, which have been beautifully restored. Well, bits of them have been knocked down and then bits of them have been restored. But where they've restored them on the old courtyard pattern with an enclosed but shared space. And I think that European countries did design very cleverly this idea of enclosure that's also, that's non-forbidding. Can I call it non-forbidding? So it's enclosed and you have to have an entitlement, but you can get the entitlement. And it's private because it's owned by whoever owns it. In many of those cases, it used to be private landlords, but now the residents have a collective right to actually take it over as a shared ownership or a housing association. I think, we can come up with lots of clever ways of sharing space and controlling space and keeping it open and making it sufficiently secure for people in the city to feel safe. And I think we mustn't be, it's either this or that. It must be this kind of collective idea. And I have talked to some really prominent architects who are working with really horrible developers, let me call them, trying desperately to hold on to the idea of a shared space. And in this, our planning authorities do have a lot of power. And so I think that's one message I'd really like to put over. We are one of the few countries that, in spite of government's efforts to unscramble the planning system, still have intact a planning system because posh people really like it, because they actually want things controlled, and so it stays in place in spite of the government's best efforts, that can actually say, okay, this is private, but it's only private if you keep it public. And I think that's really quite interesting. And the London School of Economics actually is a prime example of that at the moment. So it's into all sorts of fights about whether homeless people have the right to occupy what the LSE regards as LSE spaces, but they're only LSE spaces on the condition that they're kept open and public. So how do you balance and juggle keeping it public and open, having it as private, keeping it as shared, and stopping it from being abused? And again, those are real urban dilemmas. I don't think they should be minimised. So yes, we can. And if we did share, would that reduce segregation? I think the one word I want to stress in this is a word that somebody called Ashamin uses he's at the University of Durham, which he calls banal encounters. By having shared spaces within very divided areas, such as Kensington and Chelsea, for example, or such as the area I described in East London, you actually do have a bumping into each other of people that does matter. And I really think it's very important that we don't belittle the way that happens. And I think, who was saying, can't remember which of the morning, I think you were all more or less saying it, that you have to actually make sure that spaces actually have enough proximity and density to them that people are forced actually to bump into each other. And one of the another study that we've just done recently is of the Edward Woods estate in Hammersmith. I don't know if any of you know it. It's right by the Hammersmith flyover. It's opposite the Westfield, huge shopping centre, and it's a big high-rise estate. I've been sort of involved there and connected there on and off since 1980. It's a very difficult estate. It's a classic, as people would say, horrible high-rise, concrete, ugly, etc., etc., except it's none of those things except high-rise. It is high-rise. Oh, no, it's concrete. So it is high-rise. It is concrete. It is difficult to manage. It's occupied virtually entirely, in fact entirely, by low-income people. Everybody likes it. It works very well. It's just had a massive retrofit for energy saving. It actually looks pretty spectacular at the moment because it's just been overclad and there's solar panels down all the south sides. And we were asked by the company that's done this work to do a social study. Was it actually helpful to the community? Did it improve social relations? And we learnt two things. One, social relations were very positive and people really, really liked living there. And guess what? Because since 1980, the estate's been really well run, which is why it's not under threat and why nobody wants to demolish it. It's actually been managed properly and carefully, which includes some kind of control, some kind of supervision, some kind of entrance guard, so that people in tower blocks on the 23rd floor do feel safe when they're aged 83 and disabled and vulnerable. So it's and the report we've done on that is called High Rise Hope. We're just revisiting to see if it's held up over time. But I just think that you can share you can house poor people decently, you can retrofit, you can make urban spaces work if you actually manage them carefully in consultation and in collaboration with the residents. And that does involve constant upgrading. There are excluded groups. This is the big urban problem, and urban areas do attract excluded groups. They not only have them and generate them, but they attract them. So homelessness, mental health, alcohol and drug problems, and lots of other things, marginal young people who float into the city. And we absolutely do as a society have to have underpinning social provision in order to cope with that. The Economist has run a series of horrific articles about the American criminal justice system. It's the place where you go when you've got repeated mental health illnesses. It's the place where you go when you've got repeated drug abuse problems. It's the place where you go when you're a 17-year-old homeless and nowhere, no recourse, nowhere to go. Robert Sampson calls it the mass incarceration society, and he's American and quite entitled to say it. It is 6 times the level of incarceration in this country. And we do have to be aware we cannot use prison as the fallback. We have to think of that vital underpinning in cities. Communities cannot carry that load on their own, but society as a whole can and has to. So I think that's one of my biggest message. So do cities bring people together or divide? I mean, they do divide, and there was a horrific article in the Observer, I think it was, a couple of weeks ago, about walled countries. The wall between Bangladesh and India, the wall between Mexico and the United States, the wall between Palestine. Is that us? No, okay. Palestine and Israel. And we in this country have a city with 52 urban walls separating communities in Northern Ireland, and we mustn't forget it, and we must learn the lesson. So segregation definitely causes the most terrible consequences, and if we don't see conflict coming, and if we don't see the kind of pressures of division and take care to actually avoid them and climb out of them, then we can end up with really, really terrible consequences. So I would just say, hold on to public assets, hold on to shared spaces, hold on to urban density. And strange as it may sound, I actually think that conservative NIMBYs are doing us a favour because they don't want housing built beyond the city limits because it's their space. And the more we build housing beyond the city limits, the less we will actually integrate within our cities. And I think I'll end on that really controversial note.